Welcome to the JISS podcast. I'm extremely pleased to have with me this morning Andrew Fox. He's a frontline conflict researcher. He has served for 16 years in the British Army, leaving the Parachute Regiment with the rank of major. He has completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, including one with the U.S. Army Special Forces, as well as tours in Bosnia, Northern Ireland, and the Middle East. He has earned British, American, and Bahraini Special Forces parachute jump wings, as well as a U.S. Army Combat Infantryman's badge. He's also an extremely prominent commentator on our own conflict here, our multi-front conflict that has been raging for almost 3 years, and general Middle Eastern conflicts as well. Andrew, how are you this morning?
Very good indeed. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So let's get down to it. I'm very interested in getting your take, first of all, on the current stage that we're at regarding our war with Iran and with Hezbollah. And one of the themes that I'm going to be asking you repeatedly during this conversation is the contrast between the combat realities that you're able to discern and the way that they're presented in much of the mainstream media. I know this is something that you've been commenting on and with lots of impact as well. A lot of people are listening to you on this. So tell me how you see our current situation at this stage in the conflict with Iran and Hezbollah, and also how you see this being reported and what the gaps are potentially between these two situations.
Yeah, well, we'll start with Iran, because I think that's the bigger issue.
Right.
It's a really interesting position at the moment. There's this sort of strange stalemate where the narratives from the two sides don't really line up because Trump seems to think he can collapse the regime internally just through economic pressure. And the regime is absolutely adamant that they can withstand the pressure. So you've got an immovable object and an unstoppable force, it would seem, and it's really which one of those crumbles first.
Hmm.
Look, traditionally, I don't think economic pressure has an instantaneous effect. It's unlikely, I think, that the regime just crumbles on the spot because Cargo Island's been blocked from sending its oil overseas. Which means the clock really is also on Washington's side as well, because there are midterms. It's a very unpopular war domestically in the United States. Prices are going up at the gas pump. People are going to start paying more at the supermarket. So that there is that pressure on the Americans, and it's really kind of what goes first, because I think it's very possible that you can do extreme damage to the regime through sanctions. We've seen that
Hmm.
repeatedly, over the last years and decades, that sanctions really do hurt them. But what they don't do is hurt them now. And so when we're looking for a resolution in quick time on the American side, that suggests that there is a higher than not chance of some kind of negotiation. And look, I think the bottom
Right.
line here is, I think if we look tactically, look, the Iranian leadership's been smashed to pieces. Their capabilities have been significantly degraded, if not completely taken off the
Right.
battlefield. I mean, there's very mixed reports about how much infrastructure has actually been destroyed. Who knows? Unless you're actually sat in the Kiryat or the Pentagon, you don't have the exact answer to that. Actually, and probably not even in Tehran do they have the exact answer because their command and control's been broken apart. But it's certainly been, reduced from where it was to a decent degree. Um, and if you can come to some kind of deal where they hand over their enriched uranium and it buys you 5, 10, 20 years of no nuclear Iran, then actually that's not a terrible outcome. It's in line with what was stated as the outcome when the war began. Regime change is certainly an implied task. It's not something anyone's really openly stated, apart from Donald Trump a couple of times when he got careless. But you could certainly claim this as a win, I think, if you get the uranium off them. And that if that requires a concession or two, the killer point will be what those concessions are. And we don't know that yet because that's in the future. So,
Right.
so, so that's kind of where we are, I think, with Iran. Um, when it comes to Hezbollah, look, it's really interesting because you've got negotiations between Israel and Lebanon directly. I think that's actually technically illegal in Lebanon to have direct communications with the Israeli state.
Yeah, one of
Uh,
the Israeli demands is for them to roll back that law that makes it illegal.
yeah, so that's really interesting that they would find a space to carve out that negotiation. Um, any agreement with the Lebanese government is aspirational, I think, simply because of Hezbollah. They are more powerful in some respects than the Lebanese state itself. Militarily, certainly they have been more powerful. Where they are now, probably still are. Um, and really, they are the factor here. Now, they've been heavily degraded, even down to the point where the IRGC had to send in their own commanders to replace the decimated Hezbollah command chain. Their financial pathways will be limited but not removed. The Iranian cash flow can still flow to an extent. And of course, they have their global crime network, which will bring in revenue as well. So they've got funding
Right.
streams. Israel's strategy seems to be that forward defensive thing that we've seen in Gaza, where you create these buffer zones and look, break the risk down into three. It's opportunity, intent, and capability. You can't really change the intent. So what you can do is degrade their capability, which Israel has been doing, and
Right.
you can remove the opportunity by creating a buffer zone along the border so they can't physically send Radwan fighters over the border into Israel. Complicating factors, I think in the last couple of days, we're starting to see the increased use of FPV drones, which I
Yeah.
think is a really interesting development that really should be kind of top of the list um, for the IDF Chief of Staff, quite frankly, because we've seen in Ukraine how quickly these things can spiral once the drone capability comes online. You're essentially then in a cat and mouse game of measure and countermeasure. Um, I've not yet seen evidence the IDF is ready for that. They may well be. They may well be. But it took Ukraine a reasonably long time to get there. And if Israel hasn't been practicing and preparing for things like fiber optic cable powered drones, then that could get expensive quite quickly. And it's one of those ways in which war has been not changed, but certainly advanced by drones. And it's why I've been saying for ages that counter drone defenses are really the most important thing any military should be focusing on right now, even above and beyond an offensive capability. Defending
Hmm.
yourself against these things is the harder thing to do. And the Ukrainians show that you can actually make drones and deploy them to the front line really quickly. They can make 10,000 a month and get them
Yeah.
to the front. That's the easy part. Stopping them's the hard part. So for me, that needs to be the focus. But overall, I think we're not in any place in Lebanon where we're seeing a conclusive solution yet. We're not seeing an end to Hezbollah, a restoration of the Lebanese state, a situation of peace with Israel. Like these things are very much aspirational still, but
Right.
we are seeing steps in that direction, and steps in that direction are only a good thing. How
Right.
far we get down that road is the bigger question.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Very interesting. There are, I'll just add for the viewers, there are multiple Israeli solutions to the problem of quadcopters, first-person drones. All three major Israeli defense companies, IAI, Rafael, Elbit, have developed solutions. And there are also computerized gun sights that have been developed. At what stage is the IDF, and in terms of its acquisition and deployment, is a very good question, and one that we should certainly be verifying. I'm actually talking to the IDF about this, trying to find out where they are in their acquisition program. I couldn't agree with you more that this is a top priority and a sign of the modern battlefield, as Ukraine and Russia have so clearly shown us. It's interesting. One of the paradoxes that I identify in the narrative surrounding Lebanon, and tell me how you see this, is that the more the IDF actually weakens Hezbollah's capabilities, and I think we can agree that if we look at the graph from, say, 2.5 years ago to today, Hezbollah is significantly weaker, in every indicator. And yet, of course, it's still a formidable threat, but it's getting weaker. And we're seeing the knock-on effect. The Lebanese state is getting more emboldened to confront, even if it's just rhetorically. I think that still has significance to tell Hezbollah, you have to stop fighting Israel, stop dragging Iran's wars to our territory. You're raining destruction for a foreign interest. This is not a Lebanese interest. These are things that we've never heard before from the Lebanese government. And so I think the more Israel weakens Hezbollah, the more emboldened the Lebanese government and possibly the security forces, although we haven't seen that yet, could become more emboldened. And yet, in the international narrative, it seems that the focus is on just ceasefire, ceasefire, stop the fighting, even though that's not necessarily what's in Lebanon's immediate national interest. Do you view this paradox? Do you recognize this as well? And if so, what do you think can be done about it, if anything?
I mean, it's always the way with Israel. This is to be expected, and it's normal jogging, as we would say in the army. It's steady state. If Israel has military success, they're urged to stop because turns out war is very unpleasant and unpleasantness is bad, therefore must be stopped. I mean, it's a deeply facile argument, but it is a compelling one because it speaks in the language of oppressor, oppressed, victim, and aggressor. You know, this ties into a wider paradigm that I think we see dominating discourse in the West far too often. Um, Look, there are really unpleasant things that have come from incursions into southern Lebanon. You know, 100, well, sorry, 1.5 million people displaced, numerous houses and things destroyed. But we need to look at the why, and the why is Hezbollah, and that's what people seem to miss that loop. They seem to think the why is Israel, which makes no sense at all. Because why would you waste your young men, your national finances, your defense capability on doing that unless there was a reason to do so? It just doesn't logically follow. So there's this continual error breakdown in logic that we see here. But look, Hezbollah, I mean, I've been down to that northern front. I've seen the tunnels that Hezbollah built. I've been in one of the tunnels. That was very,
Hmm.
incredibly impressive piece of architecture in some ways. The way they dug into the chalk. And one thing I did when we got back, actually, really interestingly, we went to an OSINT guy and looked at the development of this tunnel over time.
Hmm.
We couldn't work out what they were doing with the spill, but they built a road. They built a road over the top of the hill underneath which the tunnel was. You can see this road developing over time. It goes nowhere. It goes
Right.
absolutely nowhere. But it's just that's what they did with the spill to cover
Right.
their activity that was 500 meters away from a UNIFIL base. Um, so this architecture throughout the south is infested
Yep.
in every respect, and people just don't seem to understand that. Now, has the IDF done a good enough job of explaining that to the world? Possibly not. But they're also up against um, a media class who know and are threatened by Hezbollah.
Right.
They direct threats towards journalists in Beirut if journalists went to see the tunnel that I went to.
Right.
So they're operating in a poisoned media environment that isn't prepared to share this stuff. And it leaves the world with a misunderstanding of what's actually going on south of the Litani.
Right. Absolutely. And, one of the things that I've noticed for years, even before this war, is how adept the asymmetric terror armies, as they're called by the idea of Hamas, Hezbollah, and others, how adept they are at sort of doing the embed into the civilian area. They entrench themselves into every conceivable civilian facility, hospital, school, UN facility, especially in Gaza. We see that the tunnels, and of course, this gives them an advantage because they don't want to fight, fighter to fighter. They're not coming at us, with brigades of tanks and jets. That era of conflict is decades behind us. So that gives them an operational advantage because, of course, it makes it so much harder to detect them and to take them out, and it's very hard to find a center of gravity. And of course, these are exactly the challenges that the Israeli intelligence community has been working on. But it automatically also gives them this media or information battlefield advantage at the same time. It seems to be simultaneous. So, not only is it harder for the IDF battalion commander to spot them, they can also, to those who want to make them invisible from the media narrative, they can also become invisible there, right? Do you see the double advantage that these asymmetric adversaries employ? Is it deliberate? Is there anything in your view, from your unique vantage point, that we in Israel can do to improve our ability to expose them, literally expose their role in bringing fire to civilian areas, or do you think maybe it's a lost cause?
Look, I think it makes sense for them to do what they're doing from a purely military perspective. Stand fast the law of armed conflict because they're not interested in that
Right.
anyway. But all warfare is the story of measure and countermeasure and development, just as it is with drones. Um, think back to World War One, where the machine gun led to the creation, well, led to the widespread use of the trench, which led to the
Hmm.
invention of the tank, which led to the invention of the anti-tank weapon, which led to
Right.
the invention of the aircraft and then anti-aircraft weapons. This is just what warfare does.
Hmm.
And Israel has such an overwhelming superiority in terms of what you would call ISTAR. And for the uninitiated, that's intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance platforms. So eyes in the sky, if you will. Israel's overmatch is so huge that they have to do something. They can't stop it. So what do? You go underground. You go in amongst civilians. Um, Added to which, it's also nothing new at the same time. Mao said that the gorilla swims through the people like fish
Right,
through the sea. This is interesting because they're not guerrillas. They're a kind of hybrid army that wears civilian clothes, that
right.
still has recognizable platoons, companies, battalions, even brigades. So that this is a sort of hybrid evolution of that concept where they've taken guerrilla principles and have applied them to effectively to a regularized force, whilst
Hmm.
retaining some asymmetric capability as well. So it's an interesting paradigm that they've developed, particularly in Gaza and southern Lebanon. Um, how do you expose it? Well, it's really tricky because they've spent a long time seeding the ground with a narrative that supports their new tactic. And I think that's something that I think is perhaps often overlooked is that the narrative victory and their tactical efforts have gone hand in hand because
Right.
the two are designed in sync. Look at how Hamas pushed media teams out with every ambush squad that had a live stream back to an underground headquarters. So even if the squad goes out and gets killed by the IDF, you've now got really good footage of you attacking the IDF and showing that you're strong, quote unquote.
Right.
You've got a dead journalist because it wasn't your, military PR guy, it was a journalist. I know what you're
Yep.
talking about.
Yep.
So that's clever as well. And then you've got a bunch of footage that you can, now disseminate around the world to show what monsters the IDF are. And those, so this whole thing goes paradigmatically hand in hand. And I think initially, I think that was the failure in understanding that led to the kind of the global commons defeat, if you will. The overarching narrative for masses that has dominated the media sphere for the last 2.5 years. I think failure to understand that, I think, is was the key mistake there.
Yep.
So that's where I'm looking from. It makes military sense from their perspective, and they have worked out a way to doubly weaponize it. So it's two for the price of one as far as they're concerned.
Right. Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic description that you just gave there. And I know that in terms of the actual, as you call it, the arms race, the race between the planners on both sides, the IDF has made good progress in what they call closing the sensor to shooter cycle, to give as little time as possible between the time that they detect the target, however embedded or hidden it is, until bringing the precise firepower munition as precise as possible to the coordinates. They've developed a whole digital combat command system where all the forces are linked in, the Air Force, the ground forces, the various branches, the Navy. They share targets on a digitized computer system. It's all very advanced, and I think that there's a lot to share with our allied militaries on that front. And yet on the parallel media front, and this is the theme that I'm constantly returning to. It couldn't be more different in terms of the ability to tell the story, to expose, and it's exactly for the reasons that you've described. So I'm wondering, also your experience in Afghanistan. Did you see similar tactics? Were they doing similar things, the adversaries that you were dealing with there, or was it a different story?
No, not really. I mean, they weren't. They certainly weren't uniformed, so they were operating in civilian clothes in and around the local population. They would very often use children as spotters against us. But that was never with the design to get the child killed. They'd use children as spotters because we were less likely to kill them.
Hmm.
So that was slightly, almost in some ways, the opposite. Likewise, their media was dreadful. They didn't have those capabilities. But of course, this was 20 years ago.
Right.
It wasn't when everyone had a mobile phone and an internet connection. Hell, even we didn't have mobile phones and internet connections in the field. So, I would go for weeks on end without talking to people back home because it was satellite phone or nothing. So it was a very different kind of war. And I'd imagine that should we fight that war again, it would be very, very similar to how we see in particularly Lebanon today, less so Gaza, because I think the Taliban lack that nihilism that Hamas have.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's
Interesting.
almost like the human sacrifice strategy in Gaza, which I don't think we even see in Lebanon. Hezbollah use civilian infrastructure, certainly, but what they're not doing is deliberately trying to get as many Shia Lebanese killed as possible. That's a very Hamas-centric thing. So yeah, it's slightly different. And then, of course, it was just the technology was so different in Afghanistan, so much more primitive than we see today.
Right. Okay, very interesting to compare and contrast those experiences. In terms of what's happening in Britain today, do you think it's right to conclude that there's a huge gap between, say, the British defense establishment and its willingness to learn from the experiences of the IDF for its own, future operations, and let's call it perhaps the political slash media atmosphere, which is pretty hostile to Israel. And on top of that, we also have some very important contracts between Israeli defense companies and the UK Ministry of Defense. How do you view this whole sort of matrix of relations, which has a very visible level and a quieter level? How do you view that whole situation?
Well, it's frustrating, and look, I know we declined to send somebody to the lessons learned session that the IDF ran. Um, However, I did write a paper on it, which I think covers off most of the topics. And I know that's done the rounds, certainly at the tactical level in the British Army, because my friends have shared it amongst themselves.
Right,
But that's not an official policy.
right.
So, that's really the issue here. And look, there are lessons that come across from Gaza and Lebanon, and there are lessons that don't. And the skill is working out which ones do and don't. I mean, look, logistic chain is the obvious one. You're operating on your borders, which gives you a completely different logistical problem set to the one that we would ever face,
Sure,
which would inevitably involve crossing water at some point.
sure. Hmm.
But we can look at ammo stocks. If that's a great lesson. If you look at how many, burning through, I think it was 90,000 rounds off the top of my head in the first couple of months of the war of artillery ammunition, causing a shortage. That's a problem. Um, there was a shortage of precision airdrop munitions, particularly during Gideon's chariots, that led to
Hmm.
2,000 pound bombs where you prefer to use smaller yield munitions, which
Hmm.
then of course caused more collateral damage, which then of course gave the enemy more of a stick to beat you with on the international stage. So logistics had a direct knock on to information strategy and perceptions of legitimacy. This is important stuff that we can take away from the IDF. Syed,
Hmm.
as you were talking about, the digital system
Yep.
is now battle proven, and it's far more advanced. I've worked with the American equivalent. I've not yet seen the British. It wasn't in service when I left, but it's certainly far more battle proven than theirs is, which strikes me as a great thing to learn from.
Right.
Because there are advantages and disadvantages to these things. I found working with the Americans that actually quite a lot of the time commanders were literally lost in their phones. The little drop down thing on their chest. They
Sure.
were commanding the battle off there and losing situational awareness. Like, is that something Israel experienced? Is it something that can therefore be easily overcome? These things are at the low tactical level are really important. Um, if we look at the performance of Trophy, you know, the um, the um, um, the armored protection system, the active protection
Yep.
system for tanks.
Yep.
This is again a bit of kit that certainly looks very useful against drones, which I don't think it was designed for originally. It was designed for anti-tank missiles, but
Correct.
it's certainly had
Yep.
a huge utility in defeating FPV drones coming at armored vehicles.
Hmm.
Use of the D9 dozer. I think this is a fascinating one because are they as capable as, um, say, a high-end tracked armored vehicle designed for engineers? Probably not, but they are cheap, they are producible at mass, they are able to be remote controlled. And actually, a sort of a blended force of D9s and proper traditional armored vehicles actually looks very capable to me.
Hmm.
Uh, and the way Israel's used them is not just for, you know, putting up earthen berms. They've used it to push logistics across road junctions. They've used it for counter IED. They've used it for, leading the assault in certain circumstances where they're clearing a route for the assaulting troops coming through behind. This is for urban warfare, which I think we're almost certain to face if we deploy to Eastern Europe. These are all really important lessons we could get on top of now. And I don't think there's any appetite at all to work with Israel at this stage, which is both, I think, a residual enmity between certainly the UK and Israel. There's always been a little bit of friction between our countries. We've never been very, very tight allies for obvious historical reasons. But it's also a result of the the overwhelming success of Hamas's information operations over the last 2.5 years, which has made Israel exceptionally toxic, particularly in Western Europe.
Hmm.
And that is something I think it's going to be important to get past at some point in the future, but it's not going to happen quickly.
Right. And regarding the issue that you raised earlier about commanders getting lost in their screens, a problem that civilians and commanders could share, but the cost of error here is a lot higher for the commanders unless you're driving. It's very interesting because I've heard IDF planners and people from the defense industries making these systems absolutely address that issue. And their solution seems to be to use AI to try and tailor the information to make it as relevant as possible to the sectors and to not saturate them with information that's not actionable. They've also introduced watches. It's a separate system for the more tactical field commanders so that they can, take a look at their watch and keep moving in the right direction and get the right data, but absolutely something that they're preoccupied with. They're worried about saturating the tactical commander and the operator with too much information. So very interesting that you raised that, and it's certainly going to be I think a universal problem as these command systems come online. Um, let me ask you a question. You mentioned Russia, and I think it's very interesting. When we note, first of all, one thing that it's always seemed obvious to me, and it's always, made me a little bit crazy when I see that the connection isn't made. The Russian threats and the Iranian threats, particularly in the drone, ecosystem, the fact that very similar types of drones are slamming into Kiev and that have been launched at us in Israeli cities in Tel Aviv, Iranian designed drones, and then they taught the Russians how to make them on their soil. And also, of course, the ballistic missile threats. There's lots of technology sharing between Russia and Iran. And so we see a clear sort of a combined threat to international security emerging from both Russia and Iran. I'm not talking about China right now, which is its own category. It's part of this triangle for sure, but I think in different ways. Do you think that air defenses, not just Britain, but Western Europe, is something that they can turn to Israel to, like Germany has, the Arrow 3 contract, which was huge, or is Israel too quote unquote toxic in places like Britain and France and other Western European countries who are very threatened by the Russian drone and missile threat, and yet wouldn't turn to Israel for solutions? What do you think?
Well, I think it's always been the way that we tend to buy Israeli stuff on the down low. Like Afghanistan, we bought Exacta, um, which was top secret coded. We weren't allowed to say the word Exacta. We had to call it something else. Um, and it was Israeli, but we couldn't talk about it. And that's not that. That was 2008.
Interesting.
So this is not a new phenomenon.
Right.
As I said, there's always been that friction between particularly the UK and Israel, and certainly France and Israel as well, for reasons historical that we won't go into detail about. But look, I think we've already bought APS. We've already bought Trophy, I believe, for the next iteration of Challenger. We use
Hmm.
Elbit drones. Watchkeeper 450 was Elbit provided. So
Is
there
that
is
used
this.
in Afghanistan, the
It
Watchkeeper?
was, yeah,
Right.
yeah, it was dreadful, but it was one of the first drones, and it was had all the teething problems you'd expect from a new capability. Uh, it might have been the 350 back in the day. Anyway, I've digress. The point is that we do buy things from the Israelis. We just have to do it slightly under the radar compared to some of our other defense purchases, and that
Right.
is, it's not, it's nothing new. It's not a phenomenon that's come about post October the 7th. Um, we do, of course, have domestic terrorists who attack Elbit factories, but hopefully that problem will be stamped on by the law and order side of the house rather than anything else. So, look, I think there are certain Israeli technologies that are must buys.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Missile defenses are incredibly difficult to and expensive to develop at your own. And there are no more battle tested ones than the Israeli ones, and it would be ludicrous, I think, if we uh, for political reasons if we didn't start buying this kind of defenses because it's coming. If there is a war, this is coming. And in human history, there has never not been a war coming. It's always been a matter of
Right.
time. So the fact is, if there is a war coming, we need drone defenses from Ukraine and we need missile defenses from Israel, and these are just no-brainers because they are the most battle-tested iterations of those equipment.
Hmm. So let me pivot, perhaps as a final question. I didn't necessarily plan to ask you about this, but since you've already alluded to it, the Russian situation and the battlefront that's been raging in Europe. I often remind people who are not necessarily used to thinking about the war in Europe that before 2022, very few people imagined that we would have a massive ground war in Eastern Europe that threatened to spill over to other countries. Now, I draw a direct linkage to other global events. As I've said, I think that the Russians are involved in a strategic triangle with Iran and with China. And so we can see the rise of global blocs, just as we have, as you've alluded to, in previous episodes of human history. I think when you get to a situation where no conflict is truly localized and you can tie every conflict to some sort of global bloc, you're basically entering a sort of powder keg global potential conflict situation. How do you view the current situation in terms of NATO, Ukraine, Russia, threats to the UK and Western Europe from Russia? Do you think that this is a long-term inevitable clash, or do you think that there are ways that NATO and EU members can avoid direct conflict with Russia?
I mean, I think there's potentially a lesson from Israel here, and I think if we go back to that triangle of intense opportunity and capability,
Hmm.
if you can deny, I think the opportunity being the key one here. If our defenses are good enough, Russia won't be able to attack, which will prevent escalation. And I think that is the single biggest frustration I have with our current sort of politicians' position in Europe right now, is that they are not taking the obvious and relatively easy route to preventing war by just denying the enemy the opportunity. If your defenses are solid and you have a good offensive capability, they can't and won't attack you. And we are missing this really, really obvious point. They're kicking the can down the road, whilst the
Hmm.
enemy clearly shows intent. Um, and the only thing stopping them right now is the fact they don't have the capability, but because it's been so degraded in Ukraine. But it's coming, and the Russians have made this really clear. And you talk about the interconnected nature of all of this. It's why, personally, as a sort of neutral party who wishes well and wishes nothing but victory to both Ukraine and Israel, the current spat between Israel and Ukraine is so intensely frustrating. And I think the government policy in Israel towards Russia, I think, could do with a refresh, frankly. And looking at how this balance of power is now spinning out across the region, because Russia's not the power it once was. The requirement to keep them on side is perhaps not as strong as it once was. Uh, and buying stolen Ukrainian grain is not the way to kind of align what should be two allies on the same battlefield effectively. Stand fast all the bitching about the way people vote in the UN on both sides and alliances with Washington and such like. There is a core truth here that if you weaken Russia, if you help Ukraine to weaken Russia, you will weaken Iran, and therefore you will weaken their proxy networks. And if you take security as the most important function of government, you know, really this is a frustrating phenomenon to watch. But yeah, I think that's how you deny,
Hmm.
escalation across all three of these fronts is deny the opportunity, because you can't really stop the capability. You certainly can't change the intent, but you can make sure the enemy never gets a chance to take a shot at you.
Yeah, and I think that's also the best answer to those who say you can't defeat an idea, you can't defeat intent, you can't defeat ideology. Well, that's true. Neo-Nazis are still with us, but they don't have an army or a state for that matter. Long may that continue. So I totally agree with you on that front. Andrew Fox, thank you so much for joining this podcast. I'm sure that our viewers will have been enlightened by your insights and your observations, and I hope that we can have you back sometime soon.
Thank you very much.